What is up, guys? Today we are going to react to The Truth About the Dark Ages from Pax Tube. I'm pretty excited. Hope you're excited. Let's begin.
Historical misconceptions can be a dangerous thing. Misunderstanding how the world was in the past
Yo,
can influence how you behave in the present. And perhaps no period of history is more misunderstood than the Middle Ages. It's a popular historical misunderstanding today that the Middle Ages was a dark time of poverty, repressed science, and everyone just being miserable. This viewpoint can accurately be called the myth of the Dark Ages. It
this isn't
generally
dark.
goes
This is absolutely of a beautiful time. It was a time of culture. It was a time of growth. It was a time of great strength. This is a really good era. And it's really sad how our society depicts it. This wasn't some backwards era. This was an era of really, like, I would say, one of the heights of theology, and specifically one of the heights of how Christianity worked through, because it really was able to gather up and convert so many pagans and really make Europe more of the Christian world. So this really contributed so much to the spread of Christ and the spread of good values. So I kind of like it. I think the unfortunate thing was definitely how there were lots of diseases, horrible poverty, in certain areas from the plague. This is kind of a lot of outside effects. We'll probably go into it, so I'm just gonna resume now.
like this. Between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, Europe lived in a state of darkness. Everyone was poor, the church killed all scientists, and everything was
That's
just
not true.
horrible. Then in the 1500s, the Renaissance and Reformation saved Europe from darkness and stupidity. Some versions go even further, believing it wasn't until the political changes of the 1700s that the Dark Ages ended.
Really?
This myth was perhaps best described by Carl Sagan, the famous atheist who referred to European history between 500 and 1500 AD as a millennium gap, a poignant lost opportunity for the human species. Sagan's 1980 book Cosmos included a ridiculous chart with a 1,000-year gap in scientific development between these years. Okay, what's important to note right away is that the idea of the Dark Ages has been completely abandoned by real historians. There are countless works by academic sources about why the whole concept is wrong. Yet, the idea continues to influence popular
Hold
imagination.
on.
It's still common in the United States, where there's a tendency to dismiss European history as backwards or unimportant. This is
Yeah, we have too much pride, unfortunately, where we call the medieval ages this, dumb backwards era. In truth, the medieval era was an amazing era. It's golden. It's done an amazing, incredible amount of stuff that I think is overlooked because nowadays no one can remember anything before World War II. Honestly, like wow, it's just shocking because I know a lot of history and I'll talk with people. No one knows anything I'm saying before World War II. All people know is slavery and Hitler.
despite the fact that America would not exist without Europe. The myth of the Dark Ages can
Yeah.
also be found online. A recent example are popular YouTube videos like this one, with 2 million views, that claim no one today could survive even one day in medieval Europe. The fact that our ancestors did survive and even thrived in this time tells you that videos like this aren't giving you the real story. So, what was the real situation in medieval Europe? Was it really a dark, horrible place for over 1,000 years? Well, no. And this video will explain why. Strap in because on this video on PaxTube, I'll be shining light on the real story of the so-called Dark Ages. Let's begin by talking about how the Middle Ages began. The Middle Ages covered a 1,000-year span that doesn't neatly fit into one box. Historians generally
There was a lot of different moments. It was a very complicated era.
break the period into three parts: the Early Middle Ages, the
Yeah.
High Middle Ages,
I've I learned a lot on this from books I've read. It was the same system they used too.
and the Late Middle Ages. It all is considered to begin around
Imagine you just call it the Middle Ages.
the official end of the Roman Empire in 476 AD. One important fact is that the Western Roman Empire had been in decline for over 200 years by the time it officially ceased to exist. The collapse was not sudden, but slow and gradual over the course of decades. The Roman administration had become so corrupt and ineffective that by the end, when it finally disappeared,
That's basically gonna be us too. Except, I honestly think America feels more like the Roman Republic and not really the Roman Empire. Maybe in some ways, yes, the Empire, but the Republic was falling because they also had like lots of corruption and problems. And it was a republic, and it really failed to do its job and a lot of basic duties until a powerful leader took over, like Caesar or Augustus. I think that might be the USA. We might be in the same situation.
Roman citizens either didn't notice or were actually glad it was gone. The Eastern Roman Empire continued, though it never matched the strength and influence of the original Roman Empire in its heyday. An important fact is that the same things that many people attack the Middle Ages for, low life expectancy, high infant mortality, the spread of plagues, these things were all also true for ancient Rome and Greece. Attacking the Middle Ages for these things while glorifying Rome and Greece is hypocritical. With the passing of the Roman Empire came new kingdoms who rose up from the ashes across Europe.
Isn't that kind of funny? Because Rome and Greece are two civilizations that are like beloved to many. They're really I don't know, it seems something that's more focused upon or more highlighted, more idolized, when in reality, it's not what we think. It's just a little bit strange because one of them is, much more the pagans, right? The Romans were pagan, the Greeks, they were following pagan, gods. That stuff is way more pushed in the public than really the medieval times. Think about it. The content we're shown is like, oh, the Greek gods and how cool it was. And then most of the time when we learn about the Christian medieval times, we just see a bunch of poor peasants. I've even seen it within like popular shows like The Simpsons. The Simpsons had stuff like that, but it's just something I've noticed.
Europe. The most influential ones were ruled by Germanic peoples, such as the Goths and the Franks. This began the early Middle Ages, which lasted until roughly the 10th century. It's in this period that the Dark Ages narrative has a kernel of truth. For many years, both before and after the end of Western Rome, its territories had fallen into poverty and disunity. Knowledge of how to maintain Roman law and infrastructure was lost. To make matters worse, for many centuries, pagan, Viking, and Arab invasions brought the former Roman world to its knees.
And Vikings are idolized. Now, am I saying that we're idolizing pagan worship in our cartoons and TV shows? Likely not, but it's just weird how Christianity is not really seen at that same level. If anything, it mostly just depicts the knights and not really as much else. It's very limited versus what you'll see from other contents.
The Mediterranean Sea suffered heavily from piracy that made trade very difficult. Plagues ravaged not only Europe but the entire world, hindering development. Nevertheless, even in this time of darkness,
The other thing too, because I learned a lot of this stuff in school. School gives a kind of skewed perspective. They talk about how Islam was in the golden age and it was liberal and free. No joke. They talked about how women had rights and it was great and progressive and it was just golden. The Islamic golden age, mathematics, everyone came to it. It was the best thing ever. And then when the same thing happens in Europe, oh, imperialism. Yeah, that's a little later though. Medieval Europe is depicted by, because I have a perspective with school, it's always depicted as just some backwards time. Everyone only knew one type of farming, and by the time they had new agricultural systems, it was already like 1700 or 1600. We're not really taught too much on the actual history and anything outside of it. Even my DBQ was just about the Black Plagues and how everyone died and everyone was just praying to God and didn't do anything. It's very. I almost feel like sometimes it could be anti-Christian, but then again, I do think. Again, I don't know how to actually feel about it. It just is highly suspicious. I'm skeptical, but I'm not gonna really make a conclusion when I don't have all the evidence.
There were beacons of light. Europeans weren't just sitting around waiting to die off. They were constantly at work trying to improve and develop their societies. Trade and economic growth gradually improved due to the rebuilding of infrastructure and the improvement of banking. In the 9th century, Northern Europe experienced an economic boom. It helped that many Vikings realized they could live better lives by trading than by pillaging. The rest of Europe's economy also began to grow. New financial instruments were developed that allowed investors to
This is good
fund trade
music.
expeditions
This is really good music.
that crisscrossed Europe by land and sea. Regular markets became held in public forums. Large towns might have a daily market which moved around different parts of the city depending on the time of day. These markets offered people specific goods like meat, fish, or bread. While the cost of long distance transportation remained high, people weren't simply starving in the streets like some narratives suggest. Then there was the church. One can't understand the Middle Ages without understanding the role that monasteries played in the
Oh yeah, one of the things that's always overlooked is that the Catholics and all the churches, it wasn't just Catholic churches, but many, a lot of the time, it was before the Great Schism, but these churches that were part of the Catholics, they would be famous for feeding the poor and taking care of them and helping them out, basically being a type of welfare state almost, but kind of held back in order to give them the ability to work hard. So honestly, the Catholics were kind of based at. Listen, I'm not even a Catholic. I'm not a Catholic. I think the Catholics are wrong, but at the same time, I give credit where credit is due. They did their job successfully, and I like the idea of integration with church and state. I honestly think it's a good idea.
development of society. The church gradually rose in power and influence throughout the early Middle Ages. This culminated in the Pope officially getting his own state in 756, becoming known as the Papal States. Under this government, the Pope directly controlled Rome and its surrounding territories. With this position of power, the papacy could now exert great influence on the entire European Church. And far from repressing knowledge, they got hard at work preserving and spreading it. Monastery networks developed across the continent where devout men gathered to study, interpret, and spread works of Christian knowledge. People came to these monasteries to live Christian lives of work, self sacrifice, and strict religious observance. Monasteries would end up serving many valuable functions. Their primary goal was religious. They were a place for the most devoted Christians to come and live a life of dedication to God. Many monks took vows of poverty and spent their time doing missionary activities. The rule of St. Benedict, one of the early codes for monastic life, charged followers with reading holy writings every day. Monks worked with biblical texts and developed religious histories and biographies. These monks, along with priests and nuns, educated Christians across Europe in the principles of the faith. St. Bernard of Clairvaux would later write, "There are those who seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. There are those who seek knowledge to be known by others. That is vanity. And then there are those who seek knowledge in order to serve. That is love." Monasteries also provided other valuable assets to the surrounding community. Science and mathematics were studied there. The knowledge of the Greeks and Romans was preserved and promoted. New students learned grammar, rhetoric, and logic. When they mastered these, it was common to move on to arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy.
Yeah, and addressing the Islam, which by the way, I think you'll get into it soon. Yeah, Islam contributed a massive amount when it came to like mathematics and stuff, but at the same time, most of the mathematics, most of the big stuff, you know, most of that stuff still came originally from Greece and Rome and a lot of these kinds of older empires which were adapted, which you just mentioned before. They were mostly adapted by the medieval churches and the state governments. for the people. So they contributed a lot, but it wasn't the main thing. It wasn't like, oh, we learned one, two, three because of all the Muslims. It was a little bit more than that.
Books were prized as treasures. If a monastic community came under attack, monks would take manuscripts into hiding in the forest or other remote areas until the danger passed. Monastic education eventually expanded to laymen, and this would develop into the medieval university system. The historian Melissa Snell wrote that modern scholars will forever be in debt of the monastics. It's a shame that many modern academics do not recognize this debt. Clerical brothers and sisters also served the community by growing grain, raising livestock, and producing wine. It was common for towns and cities to grow around a monastery.
You didn't have mass urbanization. However, you did have these communities where it was almost suburb like in a way, but also not. It would look something like this, but imagine a little more buildings and huts around. You would have a lot of these, and it wasn't like in the feudal system everyone was like a slave. People worked pretty nice. Communities were nicely bonded together, and the system worked pretty well. I mean, why do you think? Have you ever wondered why it lasted 1,000 years? Why for centuries people were putting up with this? Why do you think that? Was it because maybe there was a little more to it than just, oh, they were slaves and they were owned by the master class? No, I think that's mostly what communists have said. And I don't want to make a whole, oh, commie bad, because that's kind of boring to say. I'm just saying I think a lot of socialists and communists have seen this as like class struggle starting with this time when really it wasn't like that. It was a little bit more of community and almost collective. So in a way, it might be better for communists to talk about how we need to be more like the medieval times, just subtracting the religion. They would have to get rid of that, but you can't remove religion from the medieval times. They're just you can't separate it. Inseparable.
In times of scarcity, as the early Middle Ages was, those who were willing to live on little for the benefit of others were an immense good. It thus shouldn't be a surprise at all that Catholicism rapidly spread through Europe, eventually becoming the dominant religion. Monks and priests led by example and were respected for it. The period known as the High Middle Ages began around the 10th century. This is when the Dark Ages myth truly becomes absurd. Europe was surging ahead in economic development, science, and political as well as religious.
And if you look at GDP from Wikipedia, it was going up. It wasn't like they were suffering and falling apart. They were still growing pretty decently along with population.
Unity.
I mean, like, why do you think the plague spread so fast? Because they were developing really quickly, and you had a lot of towns turn into cities.
The journalist Seb Falk wrote, "Recent research has exploded almost every myth about the scientific stagnation of the Middle Ages. Historians have shown it to be a period of impressive innovation and ingenuity." Now, it's true that in this period, many medieval problems like disease outbreaks remained. But these things weren't unique to Europe. The entire globe suffered from plagues. So when people criticize standards of living in the Middle Ages, one must always ask, compared to what? The High Middle Ages saw the rise of Italian city-states and North Germany as major economic hubs. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa emerged as some of the most.
Look at that. Oh, how I missed that. Why can't we have this? Oh my, just absolutely beautiful. The Holy Roman Empire, massive. Look at France. They're just a little brother. England, man. Honestly, I like these borders.
Important cities of the period. The Italian navies at last fought back piracy and re-established some semblance of order in the Mediterranean. At the same time, the Holy Roman Empire,
Yeah, the Vikings didn't really get destroyed until this era. Before they were, menace and they were mostly bothering around the Holy Roman Empire and England and Normandy. That's where the Normans came from. But at this time, they're kind of gone and irrelevant.
England, and France emerged as important kingdoms. Domestic manufacturing of goods grew. Germans at this time became experts at mining. They exported iron, copper, and tin to the rest of Europe. Other European states exported goods like linen, cotton, wool, and salt. And that wasn't all. Silk and porcelain from China, gold from Japan, and ivory from Africa became highly in demand.
I actually have something to share. Pretty cool, right? Let me see if you're able to see it. Here we go. Yeah, it's something similar to this topic, so I thought it was something relevant to share.
Goods. Traveling trade fairs became popular and they gave people greater access to goods than they'd usually find in their local market. Fairs boomed in Western Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. The development of currency and loans further boosted economic development. Investors could now have a stake in the international economy. Guilds were also established across Europe that kept up the standards of manufacturing professions. The growth and development of Europe in the Middle Ages was also aided by scientific advancement. According to the Dark Ages myth, science simply stopped in the Middle Ages. But as we'll see, that is insanity. One place science was clearly felt was the improvement of
This is something too that even deGrasse Tyson admitted to being true, where one thing that the churches were really good with was they had a very good calendar system that they developed around this time. And like I said before, Neil deGrasse Tyson uses it. That's why he said he uses BC, the before Christ system, which originated from the churches. Because it was a really good system and it worked really well. Now, am I saying they were perfect and it was a great time for everything? Like, I think it was a time when there was a lot of good, but there was also a time of a lot of bad. And we gotta really face that. But we have to also understand the complexity because back then it was very different. You There was a lot of struggle. And the fact that they were able to build this all up, especially coming right after the Roman Empire's collapse, is very impressive.
engineering. Roads, canals, and ships were all greatly advanced. As these technologies improved, it cut down transportation time of goods, increased their capacity, and reduced loss. Other scientific advancements came in the field of agriculture. Europe actually experienced an agricultural revolution between 1050 and 1300.
Yeah,
Crop yields multiplied by over threefold.
they had a new way of developing. They re-strategized how they would cut the fields and use the crops. I believe it was also with new machinery that was built. So yeah, this was the change of it all, which got really overlooked at my school for some reason.
Things like the wheeled plow came into wide use. It made farming easier and more productive. The horse collar also appeared and was one of the most important inventions in the history of agriculture. It replaced the old harness system and allowed beasts
Oh,
of burdens to exert their
didn't even learn about that. Didn't even learn about that.
full strength when plowing fields.
Like I knew it was there, I just never learned that in school. I know a lot of medieval history, just in school it's very different how we learned.
This enabled them to work for longer and to carry heavier loads. Bronze horseshoes became popular and were eventually upgraded to iron. Then there was the development of the windmill. It used wind power to grind grain, which would then be made into bread. Prior to this, people had to rely on animal labor to grind their grain. Now it could simply be done with the wind. Hand tools also saw improvements. Better axes made forest clearance easier and faster. The scythe was used to mow and reap crops. Before people had lawnmowers, this is what they would do. Now, medieval
Hey,
agriculture, of course, still had weaknesses. It was susceptible to bad weather, and this could lead to famine if the weather was bad for multiple years straight. However, again, this was not limited specifically to Europe, as the Dark Age myth posits. It tries to make Europeans look uniquely stupid, as if they were unable to do basic things that other societies could do. But in reality, people were doing the best with the tools that
yeah,
were
it doesn't even make sense. So they have this whole era where they're all just backwards and stupid, and then they just poof became good. It would make more sense if it was gradually getting better and better and better, like how this is depicted in the way. It just makes way more sense.
Were available to them. There are many little medieval inventions that are taken for granted today, yet are very important. Eyeglasses and hourglasses are two big examples. We could also look at the development of military technology. At the start of the
Yo,
Middle Ages, even elite warriors were lucky to have
everyone loves knights. Everyone loves knights. You can't hate on knights except if you're like some uh SJW or some woke liberal. Even then, liberals probably like knights. They just look awesome.
chainmail, iron swords, and wooden shields. By the end of the Middle Ages, soldiers had access to steel plate armor and tempered steel swords and shields. A medieval knight would destroy a Roman centurion due to his superior weapons and armor. And
Bro, look at that. Look at that. The unicorn.
by the 15th century, even guns, cannons, and advanced siege weapons were developed. So much for a millennium of no science. The system of feudalism is also sometimes criticized, but feudalism was simply a system that adapted to the conditions of medieval life. The common people needed the protection of nobles who could afford the arms and materials to fight invasions.
Let's bring back feudalism. Come on, bring it back.
Keep in mind that during the
I don't
Middle
mind it.
Ages, depending on where you lived, your village could come under attack at any moment by groups like the Mongols, Muslims, or even brigands. The military organization that kings and dukes provided was valuable to everyone. Feudalism developed in the Middle Ages not due to some kind of deliberate repression, but due to the material conditions of Europe and the world at the time. Peasants also were not pushovers that lived under brutal tyranny. In fact, peasants were tough workers who could make their anger felt if they really wanted to. While they did have to live much more physically demanding lives than a modern person, they weren't worked as slaves either. The average medieval worker had many holidays and feast days where they weren't required to work. There were big celebrations like Easter, Christmas, and the Epiphany. These didn't last just one day, but multiple days. The Christmas feast, for example, lasted 12 days. On saint feast days, people would get a break from work to attend Mass, feast, and make offerings to the saints being honored. The veneration of saints was a central aspect of Christianity in the Middle Ages, and their relics were displayed in churches and carried in processions. Altogether, these holidays added up to dozens of days per year where people didn't have to work for their Lord. Now, don't get it wrong, working hard remained a necessary part of medieval life. Taking care of your animals and farm was serious business. Neglecting your duties could mean famine and starvation in the community. Law and order was thus strict. People at this time didn't really have humor for criminals and ne'er-do-wells. Messing with someone's animals, for example, was seen as attempted murder on their entire family. If authorities could get their hands on criminals, punishment was swift and severe. Execution of brigands and murderers was the
And the great pride in our society is they like to say how they're better than people from the medieval times. And really, humans have always been the same. It just develops a little different due to circumstances and climate. So, really, like, we shouldn't be so prideful. And remember, pride comes before the fall.
norm. One has to ask here, was law and order in the Middle Ages too strict, or is law and order in modern liberal societies too lenient? When you see rapists in the US today getting minor sentences, one has to wonder. One statistic that people who believe in the Dark Ages myth like to point out is that the murder rate was much higher in the Middle Ages than today. But this wasn't due to people being more psychotic or violent back then. It was more due to the fact that people today have greater access to medical and transportation technology that allows them to survive things that would kill a medieval person. So comparing these two things is not very fair, to say the least. As for life expectancy, there's no arguing that it was far shorter in the Middle Ages than today. But it was the medical and scientific achievements of the Middle Ages that paved the way for modern people to live longer. Instead of attacking medieval people for not living long, we should thank them for helping us. The field of medicine was another area that saw vast improvements during the High Middle Ages. The concept of a hospital, a place where patients could be treated by doctors with access to specialized equipment, became
I mean,
popular.
like, where did the symbol of Switzerland come from? Well, for real, I don't know where the Switzerland symbol came from, but I think they might have something in common together. I think they might have had the same origin or something.
Hospital systems spread across the continent. Christian religious workers sought to provide people with lodging and care. In Byzantium and Western Europe, hospitals started as part of monasteries but soon expanded into a much broader network. Along with hospitals grew pharmacies, and people gained a wide knowledge of drugs and cures. The 13th century Italian surgeon Theodoric Borgononi invented the concept of antiseptics, where wounds would be cleaned and stitched to promote healing. He fixed incorrect methods of healing wounds that had been popularized by Rome, Greece, and the Arab world. This man was a hero of medical history, yet how many people today were even taught his name or achievements?
We're not
Borgononi
taught that. We're not taught that in our school.
was a Dominican friar who even became the personal physician of Pope Innocent IV. Here we again see that not only was there not a contradiction between Catholicism and science, the two worked together. The author James Walsh wrote in his book, The World's Debt to the Catholic Church, all the great surgeons of the Middle Ages had been churchmen. All their work had been done in universities established under papal rule and with the heartiest encouragement of the ecclesiastical authorities of the time. What motivated Christian scientists was the desire to better understand God's creation. It wasn't a worship of the natural world, nor was it a free-for-all. The Church placed moral restrictions on scientists to prevent unethical experiments. As a result of all of these advancements in agriculture and medicine, Europe's population tripled between 1050 and 1300. The average lifespan increased by over 2 decades. But what about medieval food? Was that bad? Not really. Contrary to what some think, medieval people didn't sit around eating gruel every day. Most people lived on farm estates and had access to a variety of foods. The typical medieval meal consisted of barley, oats, and rye, fruit juices,
I
ciders,
mean, it's more healthy than we eat, so we should even be talking. I would eat this. I'd rather eat whatever the diet was in medieval Europe than eat anything of what we have in our society today. I mean, like, pick McDonald's or wheat and barley.
and alcohol were also popular. Meals were seasoned with natural herbs and vegetables that were usually grown in gardens. Much like today, the more wealth a person had, the more luxurious food they could access. For the average person, meat wasn't a regular dish, but it did become more widely available after the Black Death. Speaking of the Black Death, we should delve into it. The Black Death, occurring between 1346 and 1353, was one of the darkest chapters of the Middle Ages. No one at the time understood how to stop the disease's spread. Millions died not only in Europe but across all of Eurasia and the Middle East. Contrary to the Dark Ages myth,
Yeah, that's something I'm taught a little bit more on school. Usually, very early, we're taught it only happened in Europe. It was actually kind of low. They said it did spread around in a lot of different places too, so I like that.
plague wasn't worse in Europe than in other places. In parts of China, up to 90% of the population was lost. Egypt lost 60% of its population. Parts of Germany, England, and France suffered similar casualty rates. Western Europe was hit
And I find all death really sad, man. Rest in peace to all of those lost souls.
harder than Eastern Europe, which historians believe may have been related to different blood groups and immunity levels. Unfortunately for the world, germ theory and a full understanding of disease would not be developed until the 1800s. The late Middle Ages is considered to have begun after the Black Death. European society changed immensely as people adapted to, well, there being much less people. Peasants now had higher bargaining power for their labor and could demand better wages and working conditions. By the
Yeah, that's something I think we're dealing with today in our society where we have so many people in the workforce that the wages are going lower and lower and lower, and we're treated like no, like we're just not cared for anymore. That's the unfortunate thing. And due to a lower population after the plague, it did create one positive spin, which was wages were a little bit better. Still unfortunate about the death though.
1400s, Europe's recovery was in full swing and it became the most developed part of the world at the time. The Italian
Oh,
Renaissance
no, the borders are ugly though. What?
and it became the most developed part
This is not developed. Having like 500 little areas. I get it. I understand why their culture and how it was back then, but still, why? Imagine you're in class and you have to like name every province.
of the world at the time. The Italian Renaissance also began, and it's widely recognized as a great time for art, architecture, and science. But it didn't come from merely digging back into ancient Rome or Greece. It was built on the mountain of achievements the previous 1,000 years in Europe built. From this point on, the Middle Ages shifted into the early modern era, which had its own positives and negatives. To understand the Dark Ages myth, we need to understand why it exists. The Russian writer
I like it so far. I'm gonna add only one criticism at the end of the video that um I don't know. I wish you would have mentioned a bit.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, "To destroy a people, you must first sever their roots." I believe this is what the Dark Age myth seeks to do. For the people who spread it, it's not an honest misunderstanding, but a deliberate attack on European and Catholic history. If someone can convince the younger generations that their ancestors were just backwards fools, they can convince them to abandon their heritage.
That's
They can
sad.
manipulate them into following their way of thinking, their way of viewing the world, against their own intuitions. Myths like the Dark Ages are thus a form of political and cultural control. Modern liberal governments benefit from attacking medieval history because it allows them to distract from their own problems in the modern world. Drug deaths, suicide, mass immigration, and destruction of culture are all major problems today. In fact, they might be the worst they've ever been. But at least we're not like those stupid medieval peasants, am I right? Fortunately, due to the internet and rise of independent media, more and more people are learning the truth about the Middle Ages. The myth of the Dark Ages is falling out of fashion, even if it does persist in examples like those that I showed at the start of the video. Truth and fairness are overcoming propaganda and deceit. I'll end this video by pointing out how many European countries today can thank the Middle Ages for their existence. Austria, Denmark, Sweden, England,
Hey,
Hungary,
I love these flags where it's like kind of dark in the corner. I really like that. It's just
Spain,
cool.
Portugal, Poland, and many more.
And with Germany, I mean, technically, not technically, all those little areas were part of the Germanics that came from Otto, right? When Otto became Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and started this line, and it really created the Germany as we know today.
All began in this era. I hope this video helps everyone to better recognize the achievements of their heritage.
I love
This
my
has been Pax,
heritage.
and thank you so much for
Bro,
watching.
I love my history. It's just amazing. Europe was awesome. No one will ever convince me otherwise. I'll just end the video with one little criticism. I wish you would have talked a bit on the Islamic Golden Age, because I think some of the stuff's a little bit exaggerated because of certain reasons, right? Like to make Europe look worse. But, you know, other than that little thing, I think this video is awesome. I really enjoyed it. Oh, let's read some of the comments. Okay, okay. Christ is King. Based, my brother. We are so packed. Another myth. The church crushed science. Modern science wouldn't exist without the church. That's 100% true, man. Many priests and monks were the original scientists. The Gregorian calendar, yeah, that's why I mentioned before. Plagiarized by academics nowadays, CE BCE. It's nearly a perfect celestial calendar. I appreciate that you used the proper BC AD designation. Yeah, they like copied it. That and that's just really sad, man. And oh yeah, I like that honestly. Hey, Zoomer Historian, great video. One of the key comparisons to confirm this myth is by looking at Spain. This is held as hyper advanced diverse state. It has nothing of the sort. When the Muslims showed up, they were completely overruled and amazed by every aspect of Visigoth Spain, which is supposedly in a dark age. These invaders were essentially primitive and they didn't even understand wagons or other technology that the Spaniards completely took for granted. Life in Al-Andalus during Muslim rule was far less advanced than life in Europe. Any of the technologies these people understood and arrived, which was simply advanced in inferior form from the lands had taken from the Eastern Roman Empire. Yeah, man. I love this video. Pax Tube, God bless you. And, God bless America. God bless Europe. Man, I'm feeling really nice today. And, yeah, it's the end. Bennett out. Christ is King.